welcome to the first colloquium of this semester. And it turned out to be much better than I expected, I must tell you. Because when I was putting up posters, I asked my students to do that. And then later I went and checked, and in 1 or 2 hours, somebody else put up posters on this colloquium posters, because election time and other activities here. And anyway, so I'm so happy to have Anup here as the first speaker of this monsoon semester colloquia in JNU. And Anup needs no introduction, well known in JNU, as he was always. I met him in Price College, and I was working in Price College, Bangalore. Anup was in CS, but he used to come very often to Price College and teach there. I met him through Anil Pinto in Price College, and Anil used to tell about Anup, and so we had a wonderful, nice philosophy circle there in Price College. Anup holds a PhD from Jawaharlal University, and in Norton, his first degree was medicine. He's a medical doctor. So that's a very rare tradition. I think Schopenhauer was a doctor before he moved into philosophy, but he did medicine. And Foucault did psychoanalysis, and John Locke was a doctor. So anyway, very interesting that someone comes from that professional background. I did engineering, so, but a medical doctor later was interested in psychoanalysis and the related problems. And his PhD thesis was on psychoanalysis and sexuation in cultural crucible genealogies of aboriginalization. In fact, there was another lecture by Anup in the philosophy department. I was happy to be there. So then I thought probably he could start our colloquium with a lecture here. And today he will speak on a very general topic, and not really general, it is psychoanalysis, the other side of philosophy. And in fact, as he told me, this title he has taken from the Lacan, a lecture by Lacan. This is very important because it's about subject. It's about subject that was defined by the modern philosophy. And well, I'm not really acquainted with the psychoanalysis, but I have read something. But then, to my knowledge, the whole history of subject, the history of modern subject, from Descartes to age, there are very interesting attempts to reconstruct subject, even right in the beginning. And if you remember this famous debate between Princess Elizabeth and Descartes, Elizabeth was a student of Descartes, you can say. And so then he was asking about, okay, this is a subject means the race copicans, which is not extended, which is not material, and how can it affect the body? That was the first question. And then under her influence, Descartes wrote Passion, the passions later, and relating that subject to the bodily processes and mental processes, etc. And a second instance would be Nietzsche, slicing the subject, saying that there is not just I, there is a bigger I behind that I that pushes me to do these things. And see, why do I philosophize such questions? And third, of course, Sigmund Freud and Lacan. So it's a great tradition, and the discourse on subjectivity in 20th century, and that's how I understand this. And I should also mention that there are many here from other institutions in Delhi, because I got a lot of response from other institutions what is this philosophy colloquium. That's very positive, and we will try our best to organize this colloquium on a regular basis, so maybe at least one colloquium a month, so we have at least 4 or 5 colloquiums in a semester. So I invite Dr. Anup to give this first lecture in the Colloquium.
Thank you, Gaurav. Can I be heard at the back? You can? Because today primarily I'll be reading out, so not speaking the way I did the other day. I have titled the paper or the talk, Psychoanalysis, the Other Side of Philosophy. And the moment I titled it like this, I think I went a little captive to my title and got a little tied up, I would say, I must admit, in the title, in the very title, and the way it came to me thereafter. So I think what I have to do is to really try and see what is this other side and why did I put it this way at all. Psychoanalysis, the other side of philosophy. So what do I mean by the other side? Let me read out at least the first part, which tries to set up the problem, and then see where we can go from here. Jacques Lacan and his seminar 17, delivered at the law faculty in 1969-70, is titled The Other Side of Psychoanalysis. Lacan was undecided as to whether he should title this seminar Psychoanalysis Upside Down, that is a revival of the Freudian project Upside Down, and Marx purportedly did the same with Hegel, which Althusser and Sarah Kaufman show why this kind of overturning or this kind of overturning of Hegel is problematic. However, what Lacan tried to suggest was that he himself was divided between suggesting it was psychoanalysis upside down, and the other option that Lacan played with was that it was the other side of psychoanalysis, that is a revival from the other direction. And this is where I was taking off, actually, the other side of psychoanalysis. And I myself remain undecided. I initially thought psychoanalysis the other side of philosophy, but it could well have been philosophy the other side of psychoanalysis, and we will see what happens there. I would initially take off, and this is the preamble, and then I have the sections according to this preamble, taking off from Foucault's take or distinction, if I may put it this way, between philosophy and what he called askesis in Hermeneutics of the Subject. This paper argues that psychoanalysis could indeed be seen as the other side of philosophy, an other side that is also somewhat closely related to the philosophy of the other, or the other of philosophy perhaps. So this is something I'll develop, why the distinction between philosophy and ascesis that Foucault marks could be interesting or important to us. Why, however, would psychoanalysis be the other side of philosophy, other side of which philosophy, and which psychoanalysis would be the other side would have to be examined, perhaps demonstrated. And that is the problem I have been struggling with since this came up as a suggestion between me and Bob. One will also have to see what is the other side. What does it mean to be on the other side or not to be on the other side? What kind of an other side is this? Is it a real spatial entity, or is it like the other side of a mirror? an other side that reflects philosophy, but a laterally inverted image of philosophy or a philosophical disposition. So this is one problem. The other question is, what is there on the other side then? I quote Lacan here. One possibility is that there is on the other side the fragile smoke of dreams, like rebuses at the bottom of one's dish, bungled actions like typographical errors, both of which are successful in their signifierness rather than failed signification. The frivolity of jokes, the specific joy of which, as Freud shows us on the basis of his technique, stems from the fact that they make us share in the dominance of the signifier over the significations of our fate that are the hardest to beat. Wolfman's script would be an example of this, but I'll come to that. Turning away from psychoanalysis marked by the repressive hypothesis, Oedipalization, and the interiority of the desiring subject, as also the mystical faith in the autonomy of the life of the mind, in much of analytical philosophy, Lacan and Derrida, in their respective ways, develop, according to me, the other side of psychoanalysis, which also happens to be the other side of philosophy. And here is the little confusion I wanted to share with you all. In their rewriting of psychoanalysis, Lacan and Derrida, do they rewrite philosophy? Or perhaps, and this is the problem, in their rewriting of philosophy, do they rewrite psychoanalysis? And I remain a little undecided on this question. The paper further asks, does the Freudian turn to the akratic? And akrasia is something we will look at as we go along. The bodily ego, or of embodiment, and sexuation, do these take psychoanalysis to the other side of philosophy? So I marked 3 over here: akrasia, embodiment, and sexuation. And other side, Foucault inaugurates in History of Madness the turn to what Foucault calls the hollowed out void, the turn to the other side of an algebraic X of Western culture called rationality. And other side, Irigaray inaugurates in Speculum of the Other Woman. Akrasia primarily in History of Madness, embodiment and sexuation primarily in Irigaray's Speculum of the Other Woman. Between Lacan's rewriting of the philosophy of the subject in Seminar on the Purloined Letter, and I'll come to this, remarks on Daniel Lagache's presentation, and Logical Time, an assertion of anticipated certainty, I have picked out 3 essays from Irigaray actually, and these are the 3. And Derrida's rewriting of philosophy of mind and the topographical in Freud and the Scene of Writing, where he invokes the mystic writing pad, and the Wolfman's magic word, a cryptonymy, do we get a glimpse of psychoanalysis as the other side of philosophy? Is Heidegger's critique of the Cartesian cogito an alter ego of the Freudian decentering of the subject? Through the paradoxical and counterintuitive embrace of the cogito as the subject of the unconscious, does Lacan open the other side of Cartesian philosophy? What does the Lacanian Real do to Kantian philosophy, specifically the idea of the noumenon? Does Girinder Shekhar Bose's rewriting of a new theory of mental life, and there is a little bit of a rupture from Freud over here, through the rewriting of the Yoga Sutra primarily and and the Bhagavad Gita also create conditions for an other side of philosophy. Now, all of this, which I have just put down telegraphically, I haven't explained anything. These are the sets of questions that animated me and actually encouraged me to embark on this investigation. What does it do to what could be called a kind of an apparatus? And I'm just setting it up. It's the metaphor of the banyan tree. And let us see how we can make use of this metaphor as we go along. Does the psychoanalytic turn, which is a kind of epiphyte on a support tree, a banyan tree growing on a support tree, does the psychoanalytic turn hollow out its own support tree philosophy? So a banyan tree grows on a support tree, and sometimes it does happen that the banyan tree, as it grows with its aerial prop roots, hollows out the support tree. So this is one possibility. Does the main trunk of psychoanalysis get hollowed out in turn and in the process? And this is what happens to the banyan tree sometimes. The main trunk becomes indistinguishable after a point, and what you have are prop roots, aerial prop roots. And what we end up with are just prop roots, and the support tree has been hollowed out. The main trunk has been rendered somewhat redundant, and what we have are aerial roots or prop roots. So the question I'm asking over here, would this, as we try to go along this path, does the psychoanalytic turn hollow out its own support tree philosophy? Does the main trunk of psychoanalysis get hollowed out in turn and in the process? What remain are perhaps prop roots. What we end up with is the banyan vine of a vast network of innumerable prop roots of both psychoanalysis and philosophy, which are perhaps other sides. And this put a question to me, what does this mean? And I was feeling that, well, this is not a lament. It's not a lament. I see the hollowing out of the classical support tree of philosophy and the largely Christian main trunk of psychoanalysis, which I do not have the time today to discuss, but which Foucault discusses in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, as a possibility perhaps for both philosophy and psychoanalysis. So in that sense, the metaphor of the banyan with the remainder of the prop roots could be one way of revisiting the relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy. This, of course, would not allow us to do what I did in the earlier discussion, probably in the philosophy department, that it doesn't allow us two things. One, philosophy of psychoanalysis. Two, psychoanalyzing philosophy. So I'm trying to at least stay clear of these two tendencies, but whether I manage to do that is of course a question. One has to see whether it indeed happens. I'll now take up each of the questions one by one in the 45-50 minutes I have. This was the setting up, and I'll try to do as much as I can do of the subsections of the sub-questions one by one. Here I may speak a little because it's not easy to read out the whole paper. It's a little long, and I don't think I'll manage to do it in an hour. I've titled the first section, and that is where I'm taking up the question of philosophy and ascesis. It is titled Between Foucault and Foucault. And here the question that one is asking, once again, yet again I must say, is what is philosophy? And this is a question asked by many in different ways. I'm trying to set up the question in a particular way today, in my own little way, I think, where philosophy is not seen just as an academic discipline, but as Pierre Hadot suggests, a way of living or as Foucault suggests in the introduction preface to Anti-Oedipus, a way out of living counter to all forms of fascism. The practice of philosophy as a way of becoming. Philosophical activity as an exercise and experience. For Foucault, philosophy is still what it was in times past, that is an ascesis as an exercise of oneself in the activity of thought. Foucault explicitly describes his own philosophical practice as a concern to transform oneself and the way one sees to regard otherwise the same things. Philosophical activity for him, at least in this section of the hermeneutics of the subject, not as a form of accumulating knowledge, but as a kind of exercise, askesis, and which doesn't necessarily mean the practice of self-denial, which is why one needs to mark the distinction between the ascetic and the ascetic. Askesis came to be almost exclusively practiced as self-renunciation in the development of Christian asceticism. However, in its Greek context, the word meant exercise as in training, practice, and Foucault points out in this little section in hermeneutics of the subject that in the Greek context, it had a positive and productive meaning. Exercising meant perfecting oneself, developing one's capacities, becoming who one is. Ascesis results in subtle transformation. Philosophy, for Foucault in the ancient world, was the practice of a certain way of living and speaking, a certain way of being with oneself and with others. This way of living was defined by the care of the self, but that is what I won't take up today. Such an experience of philosophy stands before contemporary academic philosophical activity as perhaps a question. Foucault's philosophical practice then appears to be both a sort of retrieval from a philosophical past and a problematization of our philosophical present. By working on this philosophical practice, Foucault forces, according to me, contemporary philosophy to come face to face with that which it has neglected, namely itself. It is perhaps an argument, an urgent, fundamental, and politically indispensable task that of constituting a philosophical ethic of the self, if it is true that after all there is no other point of resistance to political power than in the relation of the self to itself. And here, between Foucault and Foucault, I mark a distinction between a more diagnostic moment in Foucault, when Foucault writes What is Enlightenment on Kant, and an ethico-poetic moment in Foucault, which is the care of the self in the hermeneutics of the subject. Foucault calls philosophy in this section the form of thought that determines that there is and can be truth and falsehood, and whether or not we can separate the true and the false. He calls philosophy the form of thought that asks what it is that enables the subject to have access to the truth, and which attempts to determine the conditions and limits of the subject's access to truth. He calls ascesis, on the other hand, the search, practice, and experience through which the subject carries out the necessary transformations on herself in order to have access to the truth. For Foucault, ascesis postulates that the truth is never given to the subject by right. Truth is not given to the subject by the simple act of knowledge, connaissance. For the subject to have access to the truth, she must be changed, transformed, shifted, and become to some extent and up to a certain point other than herself. The truth is given to the subject at a price that brings the subject's being into play, and I italicize being over here, There can be no truth without a conversion or a transformation of the subject, that is, without a long labor of ascesis. In this same section, there is a short paragraph where Foucault suggests, and I quote him, "In psychoanalysis, the problem of what is at stake in the subject's being, of what the subject's being must be for the subject to have access to truth, and in return the question of what aspects of the subject must be transformed by virtue of our access to the truth. Well, these two questions," quote, "which are once again absolutely typical of ascesis, are found at the very heart of, at the source and outcome of psychoanalysis." And there is a distinction over here between Foucault's take on psychoanalysis in History of Sexuality Volume 1 and Foucault's take on psychoanalysis in Hermeneutics of the Subject. Taking a somewhat wide-angle historical view over 2 millennia, Foucault finds again in psychoanalysis the questions, interrogations, and requirements which are the very old and fundamental questions of ascesis as a condition of access to the truth. It seems to me, and I quote Foucault over here, that Lacan has been the only one since Freud who has sought to refocus the question of psychoanalysis on precisely this question of the relation between the being and truth. And here it's very interesting. Lacan wants to write the other side of psychoanalysis, and Foucault is suggesting that is after a long time it's Lacan who goes back to the ascetic question in psychoanalysis, whereas psychoanalysis had really stayed away from this kind of question. This is to say, in terms which are of course absolutely foreign to the historical tradition of this kind of ascesis, whether of Socrates or Gregory, and everyone in between, in terms of psychoanalytic knowledge itself. Lacan tries to pose what historically is the specifically ascetic question, that of the price the subject must pay for saying the truth, and of the effect on the subject of the fact that she has and she can and has said the truth about herself. By restoring this question, I think Lacan reintroduces perhaps into psychoanalysis the oldest questioning, the oldest disquiet of ascesis. So in that sense, this is what marks for me the distinction between philosophy and its other side I am calling ascesis for today's discussion. And this by no means is the only other side. And this creates a condition for us to set up psychoanalysis, the other side of psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis trying to extricate itself from a kind of Christian confessional to a kind of aesthetic turn, which Foucault tries to mark in Lacan's rewriting of Freud. This, I think, surfaces or inaugurates itself in that short piece, What is Metaphysics, by Heidegger, when he discusses the folding back of the metaphysical question. However, it is also true, and Foucault laments, perhaps over here, that psychoanalysis as a kind of praxis knowledge has rarely been open to ascesis. And it is rarely that this moment shows in psychoanalysis. There has been, in fact, attempts to conceal the conditions of ascesis specific to psychoanalysis as a praxis knowledge. This, once again, splits the support tree of philosophy into philosophy and ascesis. It also splits the support tree of psychoanalysis, philosophy as the support tree of psychoanalysis, into philosophy and ascesis, and it then creates condition for me to enter the next section, which is about the splitting in philosophy, not just between philosophy and ascesis, but between cogito and being, between the I think and the I am, and the therefore that increasingly begins to look suspect. So this takes us to the second section, which I title Cogito as Unconscious. I could have put a subtitle to it. Had I would have called it Return to Freud, but through Descartes. And what do I mean by that is what one will have to show over here. Lacan gradually moves from accepting Heidegger's critique of the Cartesian cogito as another version of the Freudian decentering of the subject. And this was expected, but then comes the other side, to the somewhat paradoxical and counterintuitive embrace of the cogito as the subject of the unconscious. Why and what does he mean by this? What does he mean by cogito as the subject of the unconscious? And this is a problem one perhaps needs to track. Let me get into the Lacanian subject and what do we mean by the subject over here, and see what we can do with it. The Lacanian subject, to put it frontally, names a gap in the symbolic. Its status is that of the Lacanian real, and I know I'm not spelling out what is symbolic, what is real, but we may come to that if I find time. For the time being, let's take the Lacanian real as that which is neither unreal or real but irreal, and go on with it. This is why in his seminar on the logic of fantasy, 1966-67, Lacan accomplishes his paradoxical and totally unexpected move from Heidegger back to Descartes, to the Cartesian cogito. And we will need to see why he does it. What is the importance of this? There really is a paradox here. Lacan first accepts Heidegger's point that the Cartesian cogito, which grounds modern science, announces the highest forgetting of being. But for Lacan, the real, and the real of jouissance actually, but I'm not putting on the table jouissance now, is precisely external to being, so that what is for Heidegger the argument against the cogito is for Lacan the argument for the cogito. And I know it is not very clear yet, it will come slowly. The real of jouissance can only be approached when we exit the domain of being. This is why for Lacan, not only is the cogito not to be reduced to the self-transparency of pure thought, but paradoxically the cogito is the subject of the unconscious, the gap cut in the order of being in which the real breaks through. I know this is a difficult paragraph, but this is just the setting up of it. It will come slowly, hopefully. Of course, this cogito is the cogito in becoming, not yet the res cogitans. The thinking substance which fully participates in being and in logos. Lacan reads the truth of Descartes' cogito ergo sum more radically when he played endlessly on the variations of subverting the subject. He started by decentering being with regard to thought. I am not where I think. So the first order break comes over here. I am not where I think. The core of being is not in my self-consciousness. However, and this is important, he could have stopped here, I'm not where I think, but he goes further. However, he realizes that this takes being beyond mere thinking or language, a topic which runs counter to Lacan's basic thesis that the Freudian unconscious is structured like a language and is therefore thoroughly discursive. And this is the catch. On the one hand, he is offering us a premise where he's suggesting the unconscious is structured like a language. And it's followed by a few more steps. The unconscious is not within, the unconscious is outside, the unconscious is not an interiority, the unconscious is the other's discourse. These are the steps at one side. On the other side, he is trying to mark the gap between thought and being, and is suggesting I am not where I think. And at the same time, he is placed in a difficult relationship with the cogito. Which is why, and this is just an aside, the two minds thesis, a rational mind and an irrational mind, or a conscious mind and an unconscious mind, which actually I think, and there will be disagreements on this, which drives Jean-Paul Sartre, primarily the two minds thesis, is not adequate. Lacan hence passed to a much more refined, I think where I am not, which decenters thinking with regard to my being, the awareness of my full presence. The unconscious is a purely virtual, inexisting, insisting other place of a thought that escapes my being. Then there is a different punctuation. So he toys with two thoughts. I am not where I think. Then I think where I am not. And then comes a third formulation. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. It is as if my being is devalued to an illusion generated by my thought, and so on. What all these variations, all three, where he's trying to mark the gap, what all three variations or versions share is the accent on the gap that separates cogito from being, thought from being. Lacan's aim was to undermine the illusion of their overlapping by way of pointing out the fissure in the apparent homogeneity of thinking hyphen being. It was only towards the end of his teaching that he asserted their overlapping. So this is the catch, actually. While in its initial phase he's trying to mark the gap and trying to resist the intersection set, I think, therefore I am, later he's reaching the overlap, the intersection set, but as a negative one. That is to say, Lacan finally grabs the most radical zero point of the Cartesian cogito as the point of the negative interaction between being and thinking, the vanishing point, rather than the substance. The vanishing point at which I don't think and I am not intersect or intersects. So in that sense, it moves from I think, therefore I am, to that radical zero point of the Cartesian cogito, that negative intersection between thinking and being, the vanishing point at which I don't think and I am not intersects or intersect. And this is the break where he suggests cogito as the unconscious. I am not a substance, a thing, an entity. I am reduced to a void in the order of being, to a gap. I do not think here. Paradoxically, Lacan accepts Heidegger's thesis that science doesn't think, but for him, this precisely means that it breaks out of the framework of ontology, of thinking as a logos correlative to being, as a pure cogito. It's a poor cogito rather than a pure cogito. I do not think. I am reduced to a pure form of thought which coincides with its opposite, that is, which has no content and is as such non-thinking. The tautology of thinking is self-cancelling in the same way as the tautology of being. I try to develop this a little more now, and this is, according to me, an easier way of approaching the same problem through the 3 chapters in Ecri. Lacan puts before us in Ecri a straight, perhaps a queer choice. Either the I or the subject. And I for long mixed up the two. Either the mirror stage or the cogito. One has to decide one way or the other between philosophy and psychoanalysis, which has in the past 2 centuries largely issued from the cogito, despite its variety of forms and despite its proposed criticisms of the cogito. Psychoanalysis, on the other hand, if properly understood and practiced, and that is rarely done perhaps, promises to offer a way out of the age of the cogito, the 300 to 400 years. The alternative Lacan has in mind in this particularly strategically situated spot is the following. The mirror stage, insofar as it is indeed formative of the function of the I, the mirror as the specular I, the reflective I, the I which looks to be whole, a gestalt, but is not the I, the laterally inverted I. Lacan takes it further actually to Daniel Lagache's optical schemas, where he tries to show through the inverted glass problem how the mirror, and he works with spherical mirrors and the reflection of the image in the spherical mirror on a straight mirror, and then finally in the 3rd diagram puts the straight mirror as a horizontal mirror and tries 3 formulations from Lagache's work and tries to show how the mirror is operative in terms of a delusional or an illusory specular I. It's not, and the inverted glass problematic is simply put this: there is a glass upside down, and there is a flower base which is vertical, but the image comes to be as the flower inside the vase. And this is the image that comes to us. I'm not putting it up. I was thinking of putting it up, but it's okay. We get the point about the illusory or delusional specular I. And in this sense demonstrates that the I or the ego is a place of an imaginary blinding, a deception, far from being that part of the mind that could serve as a firm support of the psychoanalytic cure, the ego as the mediation between an intolerable id and an equally demanding superego. And this is what Lacan does away with straight away, because the ego and ego psychology and all of that is not that kind of a support one can think of over here. If such is the nature of the I, if it is specular, delusory, and illusory, then it must be most sharply opposed to cogito, with its inherent pretension to self-transparency and self-certainty. A clear distinction has to be made between the I/ego on the one hand and the subject on the other. And this is the catch, actually. This is the difference he's trying to mark. The I is not the subject, and the mechanism discovered in the mirror, the blinding, the recognition, the misrecognition, that is intrinsically misrecognition, while defining the function of the I, doesn't apply at all to the function of the subject. If the first one is to be put under the heading of the imaginary, the second follows an entirely different logic, that of the symbolic and of language. So these two cannot be mixed up in psychoanalysis. The subject, Lacan implied, was a very different entity from the one that the structuralist strategy strove to dismantle. Which is why it's interesting to place Lacan within the larger ambit structuralism. Retaining the concept of the subject in the heyday of structuralism was for him far more subversive in its effects than simply dismissing it. But how to retain it? At what level? On which side of philosophy is the question? On the Cartesian side, or to erase it, or retain it, recover it on the Heideggerian side, or go back to the Cartesian side, which is what I'm calling the return to Freud through Descartes and see, or return to Descartes through Freud and see where it can be retained. He went even further with a baffling suggestion that the cogito was the subject of the unconscious, thus turning against some basic assumptions of that period. By period, I mean the structuralist period. And this comes to us as the return to Freud through Descartes, or the return to Descartes through Freud. The support tree of philosophy thus gets hollowed out partially over here. For Lacan, however, the subject emerges only at the point of non-recognition. So I have done this before. It is at the void that the subject is. All formations of the unconscious have this in common. They are accompanied by, this is not me, I am not there, although they were produced by the subject herself. To put it in terms of the cogito, it thinks, but it cannot be followed by a therefore I am. So that is the break he institutes. They depend on the emergence of an alien kernel within subjectivity and automatism beyond control, a discourse of the other, as I said earlier, the breakdown in certain points of the constituted horizon of recognition and sense. Descartes' error, if it can be so called, consists in substantializing this empty spot of cogito by turning it into res cogitans. Cogito marks a non-place, a gap, a chasm in the chain of being. It doesn't delineate a certain sphere of being to be placed alongside other spheres. This is put in Ecri in terms of a choice. Your money or your life. This is the sense of the Lacanian cogito. Your money or your life. One is pushed against the wall, the gun is pointing at one's head, with an unfathomable voice crying out in the dark, your thought or your being. Make up your mind. One can appreciate the irony of the situation. For the moment one stops to think it over, the choice is already decided. One has lost one's being by thinking. And one can only hold on to being if one doesn't stop to think, but stops thinking. But that's an impossibility. So in that sense, your life or your money is this choice, your thought or your being, and one can only hold on to being if one doesn't stop to think, but stops thinking. But that is an impossibility. Even the psychotic thinks. It thinks and speaks. So in that sense, this is how, especially in the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, the seminar 1964, Lacan moves out of the standard account of cogito, but retains the cogito nevertheless. Proposes cogito as a forced choice between thought and being. There is as if no alternative, either to think or to be. And since there is no freedom of choice, one can only choose one way, but which one? The unconscious as cogito, or the cogito as unconscious, is situated at this intersection, the lost intersection of being and sense, where the part of being as an impossible choice is an empty set. It is in the place of the loss of being, in this empty set that the subject is located, a sort of poor cogito. The subject's place is the formal empty set of an impossible choice. For the forced choice is not simply an absence of choice. Choice is offered and denied at the same time. But its empty alternative is what counts for the subject. The implication can also be read as follows. One cannot choose oneself as a subject. One can only remain a subject by holding on to something else, a positive element of sense, which paradoxically entails aphanesis, that is the disappearance of the subject. But this oscillation between sense and aphanesis precisely is what constitutes the subject. The Lacanian subject is indeed then structured as cogito. But the cogito is structured like the unconscious. And the unconscious is structured like language. And these are the three that needs to be marked now. The Lacanian subject is indeed structured as cogito, but the cogito is structured like the unconscious, and the unconscious is structured like language. And I'm not using real, imaginary, symbolic, I'm using these three because they may not come out very clearly. These three as setting up the trouble of the subject and its separation from Dhar. This takes me to the question of language. I call this section the traumata of language. And I'm really venturing into difficult ground, and I remain a little uncertain in this section, and I would want a little feedback from you all in this section. Many who are working on the philosophy of language in this room, I don't want to name them, but would like to hear and understand from them whether one is moving in at least a tolerable direction, if not a right direction. It appears to me, having reached the unconscious structure like language, Lacan varies a little bit, plays with it, and this could be the other side of philosophy. We have done with one now, the other side of Cartesian philosophy. We are now coming to the other side of Heideggerian work on language, and let's see what happens here. And I'll end with language because I think I run out of time. So this will be the last section. Throughout his work, it appears to me, and only to me perhaps, Lacan works on Heidegger's motive of language as the house of being. Language is where the human dwells, and marked psychoanalysis as the science of language inhabited by the subject. This is seminar 3. What does he mean by that? What does he do with language? Lacan's paranoid twist, and I can only call it paranoid, comes with his characterization of language as a torture house in Seminar 3. Not prison house, not as a dwelling, but as a torture house. In the light of the Freudian experience, the human is a subject caught in and tortured by language. And I've often wondered, what does he mean by tortured? Man does not dwell in a mere prison house of language, as Frederick Jameson's early book suggests. He dwells in a torture house. The entire range of psychopathologies inscribed into the body up to psychotic breakdown are the scars of this permanent torture. So many signs of an original and irremediable gap between subject and language. So many signs that woman can never be at home in her own home language. This other side, the dark, torturing side of our dwelling in language. And this is also why there is no place for the real of jouissance, as I was suggesting earlier, in the Heideggerian edifice, since the torturing aspect of language concerns primarily the vicissitudes of the libido, hence a sexuating of philosophy or of the subject is a necessity. Thus, when Lacan implies that Heidegger misses a crucial dimension of subjectivity, and this is a large claim to make, a difficult claim to make, his point is not a humanist argument to the effect that Heidegger passivizes the human, turning him into an instrument of the regulation of being, and thus ignores something he calls X. Lacan's point, rather, is that what is missed is the traumatic impact of the very passivity of being caught in language, the tension between the human animal and language. There is a subject because the human animal does not fit language. The Lacanian subject is the tortured, mutilated subject. And this is where Lacan calls the letter kills the body. Why would he say the letter kills the body? The gap that separates Lacan and Heidegger perhaps over here is clearly discernible on account of their proximity, in particular on account of the fact that in order to designate the symbolic function as its most elementary, Lacan still uses Heidegger's term being. In a human being, desire loses their mooring in biology. They are operative only insofar as they are inscribed within the horizon of being, sustained by language. However, in order for this transposition from the biological immanent of the body to the symbolic space or place, the subject has to live with the mark of a torture inscribed upon the body. This brings us to the topic of jouissance. Philippe Lacan-Labarthe located precisely the gap that separates Lacan's interpretation of Antigone from Heidegger's. I quote Lacan-Labarthe, "What is missing in Heidegger is not only the dimension of the real of jouissance or of libido or of the body, but above all, the dimension of what Lacan-Labarthe calls between two deaths, the symbolic and the real, which designates Antigone's subjective position after she is excommunicated from the polis by Creon, in exact symmetry with her brother, who is dead in reality, but denied the symbolic death. The rituals of burial, Antigone finds herself dead symbolically, excluded from the symbolic community, while biologically and subjectively still alive. In Agamben's terms, Antigone finds herself perhaps reduced to bare life, to a position of Homo sapien, but I need not get into that. The stakes involved in this omission by Heidegger are thus very high, since they concern the ethico-political crux of the last century, the totalitarian catastrophe in its most extreme expression, and this omission is quite consistent with Heidegger's relationship with the temptations of Nazism. I quote Lagache, "But the between two deaths is the hell which our century realized, or still promises to realize, and it is to this that Lacan replies, he wants psychoanalysis, or the other side of philosophy, to respond to." Did he not say, Lacan, that politics is the whole of metaphysics, H-O-L-E? The scene with Heidegger, and there is one, is in its entirety located here. This excess of jouissance that resists symbolization is the reason why in the last 2 decades of his teaching, Lacan sometimes, almost pathetically, insisted that he considered himself an anti-philosopher, someone who was rebelling against philosophy. Philosophy is ontology. Its basic premise, as the first philosopher would put it, is that thinking and being are the same. There is a mutual accord, if not the same, between thinking, logos as reason, speech, and being, a premise which is maintained. The being philosophy has in mind is always the being whose house is language, the being sustained by language, the being whose horizon is opened up by language. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. Against this ontological premise of philosophy, Lacan focuses on the real of jouissance as something which, although it is far from being simply external to language, resists language, resists symbolization, remains a foreign kernel within it, appears within it as a rupture, cut, gap, inconsistency, or impossibility. And Lacan comes up in the seminar on the object and suggests that all philosophical activity runs away and withdraws here. And I quote him, it's quite a dangerous quotation. Okay. And in a philosophy department, it's quite a dangerous quotation. I challenge any philosopher to account now for the relation between the emergence of the signifier and the way jouissance relates to being. No philosophy responds to this task today. The freaks of philosophy, which we drag behind us from the beginning of the last, that is the 19th century, as a court of degrading habits, are nothing but a way to play with rather than to confront this question, which is the question about truth and which is called and named after Freud, the death drive, the primordial masochism of jouissance. All philosophical speech runs away and withdraws here. So he's suggesting something which is somewhat problematic. It is in this sense that Lacan tends to posit himself against Hegel's, what he calls Hegel's pan-logicism, the climactic point of ontology, of logic, the self-deployment of logos as the explanation for being, through which being loses opacity. And he goes on with this to develop the question of language. And this is what I want to end with. if he has now taken 4 steps, subject separate from I, subject structured as cogito, cogito structured as unconscious, unconscious structured like a language, language as the torture house of being. What would psychoanalysis do with respect to its relationship with language? And here comes actually the whole question of philosophy of mind, which I cannot develop today, or the topography of the mind. And psychoanalysis is replete with topographies, topologies perhaps, of the mind. The unconscious, conscious being one, ego, superego being the other. The third developed in Mourning and Melancholia, the 1917-18 essay by Freud, from which the whole question of splitting object, partial object, part object, etc. were born. The fourth mystic writing poet, which Derrida develops in Freud and the scene of writing, which is the fourth topology or topography perhaps, and I remain a little undecided there. The fifth is what I would call the crypt or the cryptonymy, which was developed by 2 Hungarian psychoanalysts, Abraham and Purloined, and which Derrida develops in Wolfman's magic word, cryptonymy. And this brings us to the question of the subject, and 2 I have opened till now. The subject as spectral, the subject as specular, delusional. The third, and let's end with this today, the subject as a secret thereof. Secret thereof is Marx's phrase actually in the essay on fetishism. So the subject as spectral, as specular, delusional, and the subject as the secret thereof. Does this take philosophy somewhere else, is the question. And this Derrida develops, building not on Lacan, on Abraham and Jacques, somewhat unknown in the history of psychoanalysis, not read much in India, at least, as cryptonymy. What is cryptonymy? And I'll just read out this section. I think it's explanatory. Cryptonymy is about a keyword, no doubt unutterable and unknown for the moment. A word that would have to be polysemic, expressing multiple meanings through a single phonetic structure. One of these would remain shrouded, but the other, or several other meanings now equivalent, would be stated through distinct phonetic structure, that is, through synonyms. We would call them cryptonyms, words that hide, because of their allusion to a foreign or archaic meaning. Certain words suffered an extraordinary exclusion, and that this same exclusion seemed to confer on them a genuinely magic power. Because a given word was unutterable, that the obligation arose to introduce synonyms even for its lateral meanings, and that the synonyms acquired the status of substitutes. Thus they became cryptonyms, apparently not having any phonetic or semantic relationship to the prohibited or the taboo word. This sets up another relationship with language, a step beyond torture perhaps. The rereading, reworking of Sigmund Freud's case, the Wolfman case, the case history material and the associated material, including Wolfman's auto-psychobiograph, dream by dream and symptom by symptom, by Abraham and Turok through the progressive elaboration of Wolfman's personal dictionary, they called it the Verbarium. Cataloging of deciphered hieroglyphics, anasemic research. Anasemia creates an angle. Within the word itself, anasemic research approaches symbols as an archaeologist struggles to decipher documents in an unknown language. So you read language like an archaeologist. The words are as if monuments of a subjective process. However, to fully complete the act of deciphering, one must restore the entire functional circuit, which implies and implicates a multiplicity of teleological subjects, and within which the symbol thing acts as a mere reading. And there shows how one works through Wolfman's symptomatology and sees, and that is where the question of torture comes, and torture comes to be related to the secret. There was, or is, in Wolfman's Verbarium, or the script, a precocious traumatic scene, removed, sent to the crypt, encrypted. Within the expressed and changing phases, the crypt is as if a tombstone of the illicit, but which paradoxically marks the spot of an extreme pleasure, jouissance, pleasure of the illicit. A pleasure entirely real, irreal, walled up, buried alive. And this actually opened up for Derrida three meanings of the crypt. One, Derrida saw the crypt as a certain organization of places. This is the spatial understanding of the crypt. An organization of places designed to lead astray. The crypt hides as it holds. The grounds are so disposed as to disguise and to hide, but also to disguise the act of hiding and to hide the disguise. What is at stake here is what takes place secretly or takes a secret place in order to keep itself safe somewhere. And he's working on the two meanings of the safe. Safe and a safe. An almirah, where you keep things. So it's a kind of a topographical understanding of the crypt. The second, he sees the crypt as where something is conserved. The living dead. The crypt is a sepulchre, the place of a non-place. The inhabitants of a crypt are always a living dead, a dead entity, semantically dead, as if neither can be inserted in the syntactic chain or even the chain of signifiers, as if both are words buried alive, defunct words relieved of their communicative function. So he uses the metaphor of the grave to understand the crypt thereafter. Finally, he sees the crypt as a cipher, a code. This is a movement as if from the crypt as noun to the crypt as verb. To crypt is to cipher, a symbolic or a semiotic operation that consists of manipulating a secret code. So in that sense, the subject then is about a secret script. The script of a crypt, or the crypt of a script, and I have actually in the written put it down as SCRYPT, the script, which carries the double notation of the secret and the written and the hidden. So in that sense, secrecy is essential, where the crypt becomes a hidden place, a disguise hiding the traces of the act of disguising, a place of silence. This is also the place of the subject, a neither nor in the world of fantasy, or a delusional appearance of things covering, clouding the crypt. And this takes me to the three notions of the subject, the spectral, the specular, delusional, and the secret. It also connects the two notions or two relationships with language, torture and secret. Would this take us to an understanding of psychoanalysis as the other side of philosophy? Is a question, a difficult question. I couldn't end with a definitive answer. I'm ending with a short 5 lines from Eliot, The Wasteland. It brings us to the other side. Whether it does justice to the question psychoanalysis as the other side of philosophy is for us to see. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. Descartes or Heidegger, Kant or Wittgenstein, which was about the nominal. I couldn't do that today. When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the road, there is always another one, walking beside you, gliding in a brown mantle, hooded. Who is that on the other side of you and I? Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful lecture and wonderful beginning on Colloquium. There's enough to discuss, and I'm not going to summarize this philosophy relay between thought and being, thought or being or die, and also bringing the subject of Anup to the question. So it's